At the ECOWAS summit in Abuja, where unity was expected to take center stage, a moment disrupted the proceedings. Nigeria's President Tinubu, with cameras rolling and ministers present, cut off President Ibrahim Traoré mid-sentence, mocking his youth, background, and military credentials. The room fell silent. What Traoré did next didn't just quiet Tinubu, it left a lasting impression on the continent. Was this the moment Africa began to clearly see who was leading? Rain tapped softly against the armored windows of Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport as President Ibrahim Traoré arrived in Nigeria. The tarmac bustled with black SUVs, military escorts, and unsmiling officials from across West Africa. Though the ECOWAS summit was meant to showcase unity, few believed in that message anymore. Inside the Hilton's conference suite, murmurs spread quickly. Nigeria was reportedly planning to push for renewed sanctions on Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The atmosphere was tense, even brittle. Traoré's foreign minister leaned in and murmured, "They're saying Tinubu calls you the boy with a gun, that you don't deserve a seat at the table." Traoré didn't react. "Then we'll build our own table," he replied calmly. He moved through the corridor without haste, accompanied by Defense Minister Kassoum Coulibaly and Economic Advisor Ibrahim Balem. Delegates from Guinea and Mali acknowledged him with brief nods, while the Nigerian group avoided eye contact, suggesting decisions may have already been made behind closed doors. Outside, a red carpet greeted presidents with formalities, handshakes and polite smiles for the cameras. President Bola Tinubu stood at the center, surrounded by his sharply dressed team, laughing loudly at a private joke. He didn't acknowledge Traoré, not even with a glance. Inside the summit hall, nameplates gleamed under soft lighting, yet beneath the polished setting, the air crackled with unease. Traoré took his seat and looked across toward the Nigerian delegation. Tinubu continued laughing. The Burkina flag stood tall beside Traoré, silent, firm, unwavering. Leaning forward, he whispered to his aide, "This summit will be remembered not for what's said, but for what's revealed." And with that, the tone was set. The first closed-door session began in an atmosphere thick with protocol and quiet tension. Nameplates, microphones, and glossy reports surrounded the large mahogany table. A moderator welcomed the presidents one by one, but everyone knew why they had gathered. President Tinubu adjusted his glasses, leaned into the microphone, and began his address with a smile that didn't quite mask his tone. "In moments like these," he said, "we must remember that governance isn't child's play. It's not for young generals pretending at leadership. Real leadership requires age and wisdom." A few quiet laughs emerged from Nigeria's corner. One aide tried to hide a grin, another whispered, "Ouch," under his breath. President Traoré sat motionless, his hands calmly clasped, his expression unreadable. But his eyes stayed fixed on Tinubu, calm, direct, unwavering. Tinubu, mid-sentence, hesitated. He reached for a glass of water he didn't need. Traoré didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence held weight, enough to pull the attention from Tinubu's next line. Across the table, Mali's Assimi Goïta leaned back, unimpressed. Guinea's Mamadi Doumbouya narrowed his eyes. Something intangible had shifted. Respect was on the line. As the session ended and ministers stepped into the corridor, Defense Minister Coulibaly walked beside Traoré. "He's looking for a reaction," he whispered. Strauss replied quietly, then let him keep talking. Outside, journalists waited. Traoré offered no response, only a brief nod. But inside ECOWAS's marble corridors, the message had already spread. President Tinubu had miscalculated. He underestimated a man who had learned that silence can carry more weight than applause. That evening, while most leaders rested behind guarded doors, Ibrahim Traoré moved quietly through the dimly lit halls of the Hilton Abuja. His steps were slow and thoughtful, his mind still processing the insult. An affront not just to him, but to every soldier turned statesman working toward a new African vision. Defense Minister Kasum Kulabali caught up with him near the executive lounge. "Let me respond tomorrow," he urged. "One strong statement to show them we don't bow." Traore shook his head. "We don't respond, we build." He turned and headed toward the elevators. Not to his suite, but down to the lower floors, where the Malian and Guinean delegations were staying, away from public view. No cameras, no aides. Just private dialogue among those who understood resistance. In Suite 409, Mali's Assimi Goïta greeted him with a firm handshake. "We heard what happened," he said. "Tinubu talks faster than he acts." "Then let's move faster than both," Traore replied. Later, in a closed meeting with Guinea's Mamadi Doumbouya, they outlined strategies on a notepad. Shared mineral transport routes, coordinated defense support, and a regional communications system independent of ECOWAS. Outside, the city of Abuja glowed with life and noise, unaware of the shift taking place in those quiet rooms. What had started as an insult was quickly turning into a strategic opening. By 2:00 a.m., Traore returned to his suite, where his cabinet members waited, tense. "No retaliation," he said calmly. "Not tomorrow, not ever. We're not here to respond to disrespect. We're here to outgrow it." While the city slept, a new alliance was forming. Away from microphones and formal addresses, Africa was beginning to choose a different course. Inside the main summit hall, national flags draped the walls and symbols of West African unity were displayed prominently. Cameras clicked, live streams ran, and translators stood ready as President Ibrahim Traoré stepped up to the podium. His voice was steady. "Our sovereignty is not up for discussion," he began. "It is our foundation. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, we are not leaving Africa. We are stepping away from control." The words were direct, but rooted in principle. Delegates turned their heads. Even the skeptical ones seemed to pay closer attention. From the center row, President Tinubu shifted, then raised a hand, interrupting. "Let the adults talk," he said with a smirk. A ripple of gasps spread through the hall. Some delegates blinked, unsure they'd heard correctly. Cameras zoomed in. A few aides looked to the floor. From Nigeria's side came a brief, awkward laugh, but it didn't last. Traore paused, not because he was shaken, but because he understood that silence would speak louder. He closed his binder, gave a single nod, and returned to his seat. His ministers, seated beside him, clenched their fists under the table. But Traore's face revealed nothing, no anger, no pride, only composure. The silence that followed was charged. Journalists rushed to relay the moment. ECOWAS aides looked unsettled. Some jotted notes they hadn't intended to write. Something shifted, not in official policy, but in perception. When Traore sat down, it wasn't a retreat, it was restraint. And in that stillness, every leader in the room was left to consider. Who, really, was the adult here? Outside the chamber, the footage had already gone viral. Across Africa, people were watching. At the ECOWAS banquet, in the grand ballroom of the Transcorp Hilton, chandeliers cast golden reflections over the tables. Gilded menus sat beside polished cutlery, and soft background music filled the room. But beneath the formality, the seating arrangement sent a clear message. President Ibrahim Traoré had been placed near the periphery, far from the head table where President Tinubu sat among foreign envoys, trade officials, and Western ambassadors. It wasn't subtle. The aim was to sideline him, to isolate and diminish his standing. Tinubu laughed loudly. Raising his glass in a quiet toast with a French delegate, the official's voice rang out, "Burkina Faso will come around. They always do when the funding stops." President Traoré didn't respond. Instead, he turned to his left to speak with South Sudan's delegate, Minister Dung Akle. Their discussions centered on cross-border energy trade and the future potential of African lithium. On his right, Guinea-Bissau's Finance Minister Alfonso Lopez leaned in as Traoré outlined a concept for a West African payment system, one that would operate independently of the CFA franc. There was a final question from the crowd. If Frank doesn't want a... There were no raised voices, no applause, and no performative gestures. Just thoughtful exchanges and strategic discussions beneath the sound of clinking wine glasses. Real alliances, Traore murmured, don't need microphones. He observed as Nigerian President Tinubu posed for photos with IMF officials. Flashbulbs captured his wide smile, but not what was quietly unfolding behind the scenes. When dessert was served, Traore stood up, excused himself with a nod, and left the ballroom. His delegation followed. No statements, no attention. But around the room, 3 ministers from 3 different countries watched him go, deep in thought, reflecting, re-evaluating. In politics, noise draws attention, but true influence is often silent. That evening, the coldest thing served wasn't the sorbet, it was the gap between spectacle and real power. At 8:00 a.m. the next day, while the official summit agenda was still being printed and delegates sipped coffee in the lobby, President Ibrahim Traoré convened an unexpected side meeting. The setting was unassuming, a briefing room behind the main hall, but the reaction was immediate. By 8:45, the room was full. Delegations from Guinea, Mali, Niger, Chad, and even observers from Algeria and South Sudan had taken their seats. Nigeria's team arrived last, their expressions wary. President Tinubu didn't attend. He sent his trade minister instead. Standing at the front with a single folder, Traore began, "Yesterday I was cut off while speaking on sovereignty, so today I will speak through action." He opened the folder and slid 3 signed documents across the table. One by one, leaders leaned in, brows raised. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea had signed a trilateral mineral trade deal, effective immediately, entirely outside ECOWAS structures. The agreement established a new corridor system for lithium, gold, and phosphate. It included joint infrastructure investment, defense coordination, and local processing. Without any French intermediaries, CFA currency involvement, or Nigerian participation. Once he was back in Europe, Gay would join Linman and go to Africa, France. "This isn't meant to provoke," Traore clarified. "It's to protect. Africa must stop asking permission to trade with itself." The Nigerian trade minister remained still. "You didn't consult ECOWAS?" he said. Traore met his eyes. "ECOWAS didn't consult us when it sanctioned our survival." A heavy silence followed. Minutes later, news reached President Tinubu. Furious, he left his suite. "They're excluding Nigeria?" he exclaimed. "Without warning?" But the deal was already complete. Signed, witnessed, and official. In that instant, Tinubu realized that the young leader he had once dismissed had just redrawn West African trade with a few signatures, and Nigeria was no longer the central figure in the room. By late afternoon, a rushed press conference eclipsed the summit's official agenda. Cameras crowded the space, drawn not by protocol, but by a sudden and undeniable shift in regional power. What was expected to be another routine declaration turned into a moment that rewrote history. Standing together were Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta of Mali, Mamadi Doumbouya of Guinea, and Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger. 4 leaders, 4 nations, 1 shared message. "We do not stand here in defiance," Traore began. "But in dignity," Goïta continued. They jointly announced the formation of the Sahel Sovereign Alliance, an informal economic and defense partnership operating independently of ECOWAS. Its foundation, cooperation without coercion. A wave of surprise rippled through the press. Journalists scrambled to report. Behind them, ECOWAS staff exchanged hurried glances. Nigeria's delegation exited abruptly. Ministers pressed earpieces, trying to confirm what they had just heard. It was real. An economic pact, a security framework, a development plan. Without foreign oversight, without the CFA franc, and without waiting on Abuja or Accra to validate their decisions, Traore then stepped forward again. His voice remained calm but firm. "If unity means obedience," he said deliberately, "then it is not unity. It is control, disguised as brotherhood. The room held its breath. A reporter cautiously asked, "President Traore, are you leaving ECOWAS?" He paused, then gave a slight smile. "We're not leaving," he replied. "We're simply walking without asking." The press conference descended into confusion. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, answers were partial and scattered. Nigerian President Bola Tinubu arrived moments too late, pushing through aides, disbelief etched across his face. He demanded to know how the summit had slipped beyond his influence, but it was already over. The alliance wasn't just a pact, it was a statement. The periphery had stepped into the center. The young leader he once dismissed now stood at the helm of a movement that could no longer be ignored. Africa was shifting, not through resolutions, but through purpose. Behind closed mahogany doors inside a private ECOWAS leadership session, the tension was palpable. No media, no cameras, just heads of state and ministers confronting a new reality. President Tinubu stood unsteady, eyes fixed on Traore. His voice, strained with emotion, broke the silence. "Who do you think you are?" he demanded. "You've embarrassed this union. You've disrupted regional order. You've insulted every principle ECOWAS stands for." The room was still. Some ministers looked away. Others stared at Traore, unsure of what to expect. But Traore didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He simply met Tinubu's gaze. "I'm a soldier who became president," he said quietly, "not the other way around." A few chairs shifted. Guinea's finance minister raised his eyebrows. Mali's interior secretary exchanged a glance with Niger's foreign minister. Something unspoken settled over the room. A shared realization louder than any statement. Tinubu stepped back, clearly unsettled. "You don't understand diplomacy," he said. Traore's reply was calm, yet cutting. "No, I understand sacrifice. That's the difference." The session continued, but every discussion that followed felt changed. Each vote and policy now carried a different weight. A sense of reckoning. Tinubu had anticipated disagreement. What he faced was something deeper. Quiet, determined resistance. As the doors opened and leaders emerged, one thing was evident. The balance had shifted. Traore had spoken little, but it was enough. Because power doesn't always raise its voice, it often waits for the right moment to speak. As the summit drew to a close, delegates stood, papers rustled, and translation headsets were removed. A tired moderator offered thanks, marking the end of the session. But just as proceedings wrapped up, one live microphone picked up an unexpected moment. President Ibrahim Traoré, leaning toward an aide and unaware the audio feed was still active, spoke softly and clearly. "Africa doesn't need dominance," he said. "It needs dignity." A technician froze. The words echoed through a few remaining active earpieces. Someone hit record, and within minutes, the audio leaked beyond the four walls of Abuja. By nightfall, it had reached every corner. In Dakar, university students projected the words onto campus walls. In Lagos, young Nigerians filled Twitter and WhatsApp with clips, juxtaposing Traore's calm with Tinubu's frustration. In Accra, a local radio station played it 3 times an hour, referring to it as the line that paused a summit. What struck people wasn't just who said it, but how. There was no speech, no stage, no script, just a moment of unfiltered honesty overheard in Ouagadougou. Across the city, crowds gathered beneath murals of Thomas Sankara, chanting Traore's name. But the true surprise came from inside Nigeria. Youth leaders in Ibadan and Kano began sharing open letters. Is this the kind of leadership we ridicule, or the one we actually need? Traore remained silent. He didn't issue a clarification. He didn't have to. The microphone had done what it rarely does, expose character, not performance. And across Africa, something shifted. A subtle confidence emerged, even a bold question. Perhaps the future doesn't shout the loudest. Perhaps it speaks last. Before sunrise, Well ahead of any motorcades or media setups, President Ibrahim Traoré quietly departed Abuja. No sirens, no official statements, no public gestures, just a single black SUV exiting the Hilton's underground garage, headlights cutting through the dawn mist. Inside, his ministers sat in silence, the intensity of the past 2 days still fresh, Tinubu's public embarrassment, the formation of a new bloc, and the viral moment still unfolding online. As the convoy approached the runway at the military airbase, Traore finally addressed his team. His expression was calm, not victorious, just resolute. "History isn't made at the podium," he said quietly. "It's made when no one applauds." Then the aircraft door closed behind him. No words followed. Photographers captured the moment. No major headlines announced his exit. But far beyond Abuja, global reactions continued. In Ethiopia, a columnist penned an editorial titled, "The Man Who Didn't Flinch." In Rwanda, military analysts praised his composure as a modern example of disciplined leadership. On Nigerian talk radio, callers questioned whether their own president had just been upstaged by someone half his age. But it wasn't a speech that shifted the mood across Africa. It was the way Traore departed, calmly, without theatrics. Because real leadership doesn't cling to the spotlight. It doesn't seek applause. It changes the atmosphere and walks away, leaving a silence that signals lasting impact. A quieter space, but one that's been permanently changed. As dawn broke over West Africa, a unique silence settled in. Not emptiness, but a heightened sense of awareness. If this story resonated with you, tap the like button to help it reach more viewers. Subscribe for more untold African stories that go beyond the headlines. Got thoughts on Traore versus Tinubu? Share them in the comments. We read every single one. And don't forget to share this video with someone who believes leadership is defined by integrity, not control. Because sometimes the most powerful leaders are the ones who lead quietly, but leave behind the loudest message.